welcome everyone to our Supply Chain Council webinar for today. We have attendees here from all over the world, so it's a different time for everybody. We will be recording today, so this recording will be available on the Supply Chain Council website under the webinar archives about half an hour after we finish the webinar. And today we're going to start our series on the M4SC, Management for Supply Chain, using SCOR, which is the Council's new research initiative. And today we're going to talk about getting started, the overview of the framework. And any questions that you have during the webinar, please just go ahead and type those to me. You can type them in the box you'll see on your on the side there. Just type whatever you like to me, anything, and I'll we'll hold questions for Joe for after the webinar, anything that you want me to ask him. I think most of you probably know Joseph Francis. He is Executive Director of Supply Chain Council currently, and Joe has also been Research Director and Chairman of the Board for the Council over the past years, has a very diverse background and extensive experience in supply chain and supply chain process, and is a global advisor for companies, speaks all over the world, and we could write a book on what Joe's been doing. So I think I'm going to go ahead and turn it right over to you, Joe, to get started.
Okay, thank you, Melinda. Melinda, can you see the presentation okay?
I can, yes.
Okay, great. So today what I'm going to focus on is we've had some presentations in the past on M4SC that have been focused more of the getting started perspective of we are trying to address some problems. What is M4SC? How is it structured? I want to go today, I'm going to provide a little bit more background around that, go into a little bit of the structure of M4SC and the problems that it's designed to focus on from a supply chain management perspective. And then I'm going to spend quite some time talking about the volunteer initiative of the research and development around M4SC, the program we put into place through the balance of the year, then through 2014, and talk a little bit about how we'd like volunteers to participate and kind of call to action for participation. The questions, feel free to ask them during the presentation. I've got a question from Dennis McClure, volume. I think, Melinda, you were a little quiet. I think I'm pretty much okay. Then what we're going to do is I'd like to have more of an interactive round of questions about the framework, questions about participation. How does this work in process, and what are volunteer teams? What are the requirements for that? Let me talk a little bit about M4SC and the background that we have for it. Over the last several years, I talked to a lot of supply chain management executives, and I always ask the same question. I say, what's preventing you from being a very successful executive in your area? Sometimes I get an odd answer, well, this year my big problem is implementing this module of my ERP system, or I've got to introduce SNOP. I always respond, well, that's kind of your job. I'm interested in what enables you or what prevents you from being very successful in your job. And the answers tend to focus on three areas. One area is that it's very hard for them to get respect or credibility in supply chain. They don't get the focus, executive focus from their organization that they feel that they need, or the resources. And a lot of times they tend to feel that they're not very strategically focused, and due to that they don't get to participate in strategy definition, and sort of the higher level drivers of the organization as a whole. The second major problem the executives encounter is they really don't have a system for management. It's very hard for them to understand all the knobs and levers within the organization, and to make effective decisions around accountabilities, responsibilities, understand job definitions, and make sure that they've got the right people, the right place, and the right time within the system. The third big problem is just, the overall overwhelming feeling of complexity that, I've got so many supply chains or customers or products. I'm having a real difficult time with handling the complexity. When I see thousands of processes, or I have all of these different teams working in all different schedules and times and operations, and it's hard for me to get my hands around it, much less for me to see my teams getting my hands around it. So these are three very common themes. So over the last couple of years, we've been listening to that, we've been listening to other problems and trying to come up with, from a research perspective, what kind of solutions would actually address these in the long term. Historically, the Council, with its SCOR reference framework, has looked at addressing supply chain issues in terms of operations, not in terms of executive management. And it had a very simple four-stage view. Here's set supply chain objectives, configure the threads within the supply chain, configure the processes, and then put the workflows in place. And then manage the metrics. Look at the feedback, make sure the metrics are working up. And from that perspective, there was just a lot of detail left out. SCOR was the dictionary, but the implementation of the dictionary is really left up to the practitioner companies to understand. From that, we literally had hundreds, if not thousands, of case studies of implementing or using SCOR within the organization. It was very difficult to discern a standard for usage within those case studies. And this lack of the standard still was and still continues to be a barrier for professionals, particularly in supply chain management layers, for being successful with SCOR. They still tend to view SCOR as a great tool from many perspectives, but they address it as a tool for solving problems. So, there's a great, 3 or 4 level kind of approach we have with SCOR projects. There's Peter Bolstorff Supply Chain Excellence. There's a lot of different approaches, but almost all of them focus on the project of solving a supply chain problem. And to be really honest, when I start to see that there's a process team, I think you've probably all heard of, a Tiger team or a supply chain SWAT team, or I've got an optimization team. I'll be honest, when I worked in a very large electronics computer manufacturing company in the past, there were no fewer than 17 different teams to go in and try to solve business problems. And what was fascinating to me at the time was in the 17 teams, each one would propose a slightly different solution to problem solving, but they weren't working together. But the fundamental issue I had with it was the problem is there was already a problem. Why did we arrive at a point in supply chain management where instead of managing the operations, problems erupt, and I've got to remove people from what we used to call their day job, bring together a special team that goes in and attacks and tries to find the root cause issues. I'm not saying that there's never a problem, and there's never complexity in trying to handle surprise issues in supply chain. But the main thing I saw was that you got to the situation where the SWAT team or the Tiger team was the status quo. It was normal to constantly be firefighting in supply chain organizations. I saw a great presentation from the Council several years back of a textile company based out of southeastern United States. And they found that their supply chain managers were spending 80% of their time problem solving. They were spending 20% of their time thinking about the future. And when you have an issue of credibility, the CEO wanting to listen to supply chain, they don't want to understand. They're not particularly concerned about, I solved a problem that erupted 6 weeks ago. They're worried about, how am I going to make money the next quarter, next half year, next year? What's the strategy? How do I get there? So when you have a problem, you've got some great problem-solving tools with systems like SCOR, Lean Six Sigma, but the problem is there is a problem. Companies don't manage themselves with projects. They, as I explained with the, the textile company, 80% of your time should be spent on management, not on attacking, tactical issues within execution. My question and our question then relating back to the overall three problems is, how do good companies manage? What are the different kinds of techniques and layers? And specifically, how do I move, and how successful companies moved from problem management in supply chain to day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month supply chain management? And I don't mean operations and executing orders. I mean the overall flow of supply chain management. So having talked to a lot of companies and a lot of organizations and looked at the bits and pieces of this, the conclusion is most companies have most of what they need, but there are barriers. They're either not integrated or they're at different stages of maturity. What we did was we sat back, and Casper Hunch, our research director, and I looked at a variety of these issues on how companies moved from supply chain management to supply chain, or rather from supply chain problem management, the SWAT teams and the Tiger teams, to supply chain management. What they all looked at from our perspective, and what they had in common, were they had 4 very specific pieces of the management structure where they had put in responsibilities and accountabilities for control. So the most successful organizations tended to start, this is very similar to the old SCOR approach, but I want to get a little bit more detail. They started with business strategy. Which markets am I in? Which products and services are we going to be offering? What are the financials surrounding how we do that? What's the capital involved? What's the revenue? I'm looking at this 1, 2, 3, 5 years. Taking a business strategy, then taking that and driving a supply chain strategy. So those organizations are tightly connected in their information, sharing goals, and analysis of the business. The supply chain strategy team, what we saw in the successful organizations, segment their business into supply chains, and then for each supply chain, determine the required performance to achieve the business strategy. Now, the first time I looked at this many, many years ago and was looking at the strategy piece, and it looked hopelessly complicated and necessary to have vast amounts of experience in supply chain. But, the result was, when we looked at this more carefully, there are probably about 10 or 15 major kinds of processes that you look at in doing the segmentation, determining strategy, doing all the decision making. So this is what we've sort of abstracted out of this. Then what happens is typically the organization looks at their supply chain network. We used to call this the threads, still do in some circumstances. Some companies may call it other things. But in essence, what you want is to make sure that the network can perform to the strategic performance requirements. So let me pose a problem here. If I have a disconnect, I've got a great supply chain strategy set up, but I don't talk to my network team and say, please go optimize the network for the strategy. Network teams are very good at optimization. I mean, that's, they've got fantastic tools to do it. They're really good at the numbers on this. But if they're not optimizing to the strategy, guess what? You create a problem. Suddenly, 6 months down the road, hey, I'm not meeting my strategic performance. Now I've got to get a Tiger team, I've got to get a SWAT team to go look at the network and see what's going on. Once I've got the network well defined and it's optimized for my strategic requirements, successful organizations then look at the processes in the network. I've got a plant that's manufacturing, I've got warehouses, I've got freight channels, I've got suppliers, I've got customer channels. I want to make sure that the processes that link all of that together are matching the network performance requirements. If I've got a 5-day order cycle time in my network, I've got to make sure that the processes are going to support that 5-day order cycle time. If I have a certain reliability or inventory requirement, I've got to make sure that the processes are going to create that reliability or that inventory requirement. I'm starting to get away from strategic goals down to very operational, tactical goals, and that I have the right processes in place to do that. Finally, I may have the best processes in the world, but if my teams aren't trained to perform the processes, if my business requirements are not set up for my IT systems to perform the processes, if the machinery or automated techniques I have are not set up at the right revision or speed or capability or reliability to meet those processes, I have to change my resource base. I have to train, I have to upgrade, I have to reconfigure. Managing the resources to the processes, the process then to the network to the strategy and supply chains to business strategy. This is basically an integrated supply chain management system. The feedback from each of the layers says I can or cannot meet the requirements that you gave me, given the constraints of my normal operations and the constraints of strategy. Each layer can communicate backwards and adjust the prior strategy or prior configuration. This drives down. Furthermore, if I have events, as an example, I may have an event where I have a supplier. I have a key supplier goes out of business. Guess what? I'm going to have to reorganize my network quite quickly. My supply chain strategy didn't change, but my business environment changed within the network. I may have a competitor that goes out of business, and I absorb all of that customer load, but I don't have the flexibility to handle more than a 5 or 10% increase in demand. I have to reconfigure the network to manage that demand increase. I may have a situation where my strategy is perfect. However, for different reasons, there may be a huge change in capital availability from the business perspective, and I have to reduce my inventory holdings very fast. I may have a crisis situation in a world environment where the reliability of my deliveries has to jump up considerably. My business strategy hasn't changed, the environment I work in changes. I need to have a team that's focused on managing that strategy within the business strategy context as well as the environment. This follows through also for supply chain processes and supply chain resources. I can have a change that's driven from a layer above, or I can have a change that's driven from the environment. Successful companies have teams that are accountable and have the resources that are responsible for making sure the change occurs and the performance tracks against the requirements, and they can put that into place without a problem erupting and driving specialized teams to leave their day job and go and try to effect the change to close the gap in performance. Now, an interesting question then becomes, what's the best way to have this effective strategically managed supply chain organization sort of, all the way up and down the stream? Well, my answer is always sounding stupid. Design the organization to be integrated, design it to be manageable. A lot of times you can come in and inherit an organization, you inherit a set of management processes, or they may evolve spontaneously to suit the situation. That's not a design system. That's an evolved, that's a sort of status quo system. Whether or not it's manageable, whether or not that system is effectively performing business strategy, whether or not that system is really using resources as best as possible within the network, I'd give you sort of the flip of the coin whether it's happening. If it's not designed to be manageable, not designed to be strategic, not designed to be integrated, it doesn't just happen magically. What we propose with M4SC is to be an off-the-shelf system or process or methodology that's a solution to forming a layered management that's integrated and manageable, and we are focusing on SCOR to be the integrating resources, the common language between each of the layers to communicate supply chain definition, strategy, metrics, performance, network definition, process definition, requirements and practices, and resource, skills, definition, capabilities, and execution. So this is sort of an off-the-shelf, standardized approach that a business can adopt and configure for itself to have an effective, strategically managed supply chain organization. So that's sort of the high-level view, what is M4SC? Within the, why we're trying to do this layering, because I've seen supply chain organizations that they have a strategic problem that they immediately erupt into process re-engineering or even resource retraining. Okay, that becomes very complicated, and my God, I've got 4,000 processes. Hey, I have a very complex supply chain. What we prefer to do is layer it, simplify the view of the organization through layering, and then we simplify visibility and accountability for the key decision areas in strategy, in network, in process. And you make sure that those changes in the management that occurs is happening at the right time, in the right degree. Likewise, if I have teams focused in each of these areas, not only am I looking at my supply chains and my networks and my processes, but allows for the other teams that may be in my organization to optimize those management resources across organizations. A third approach we've seen that's very important to avoid is that, hey, I'm going to capture every process in the organization, I'm going to capture every skill in the organization, and we're going to look at and just optimize the whole system at once at the executive layer. Well, that's a boil the ocean. What we're advocating here is to carefully segment the decisions so the people who are working on strategy don't have to focus on all the processes. The people that focus on the network aren't worried about the resources when they're making the decisions. As they're performing management, they don't have to boil the ocean in terms of complete top-down everything view of what's happening. The fourth item on this is that the strategy, network, process, and resources are very natural boundaries inside management organizations. You tend to have a few people who are focused on the strategy. You tend to have a few people focused on logistics and the network. You tend to have people within plants who are responsible for the processes. You tend to have managers responsible for the resources. It's very natural boundaries. This maps to areas in organizations that people are already fairly comfortable with. Important in this layering is that the communication of management information is explicit and integrated. You don't have someone working in strategy spontaneously trying to figure out the resource training that's required to achieve it. They communicate with the groups that are most important for the decisions to them, and the communication is timely, it's relevant, it's not confusing the situation, and again, in terms of communication, we're not having a boil the ocean approach to talking about everything when I'm trying to get strategy operating within an organization. So this is a couple of the pieces of why the layering is so important, because it decomplexifies the management, keeps it simple, keeps it with some simple boundaries, and helps everybody understand their roles and accountabilities in performing management. So the M4SC structure, there's a strategy layer. Like SCOR, so in source and SCOR, there's 7 processes. In the strategy component of M4SC, there's roughly 15 processes. The input to the layer comes from business planning, the business environment. Output possibly feeds back to business planning or down to the network layer. The main approach of strategy is to analyze and create the context, supply chain definition, and the goals for those supply chains for operation. It's a key skill. It also has to do with looking at the entire organization, has a lot to do with high-level accountabilities and responsibilities. Something that's very important, needs to be managed explicitly. It doesn't just happen on its own. It needs to be a regular process that people expect to have happen. Typically, in an organization where it is happening, you'll hear them call it supply chain strategy, supply chain definition team, a benchmarking team. These are different kinds of components that all form the strategic focus on supply chain. Next layer of M4SC is the network. We see roughly 10 to 12 process elements. Input to the network in terms of performance requirements comes from supply chain strategy. It can also come from business environment, sort of existing networks, existing relationships, suppliers, customers, competitors. Output from the network layer goes to this, possibly feeds back to strategy, but definitely goes on to the process layer in terms of what do I require for the processes to perform. The focus of the network layer is to analyze the needs and create the physical flows, the actual material and possible information flow in relation to the supply chain goals, that those physical flows to plants, to warehouses, through channels, to suppliers, to customers can achieve the supply chain strategy. Typically, you'll hear a lot of terms for these kinds of techniques, capabilities, the network optimization, transport optimization. You probably also hear about it in terms of overall logistics. A lot of that is in this layer. The non-operational part of logistics, but the part that actually controls the network definition, is what we focus on in the network layer. Within the process layer, we have roughly 20 to 25 process management elements. Input, like the other layers, the input comes from the superior network planning, possibly also from business environment. Output is going to go to resource planning with feedback to the network layer. The main focus of the process layer is to analyze existing processes or required processes, understand and create their context, define the process, what they have to do, and link it to the goals for the supply chain processes, which were defined by the network layer. The activities in the process layer, in a very familiar way, we can hear a term business process optimization, process reengineering, process analysis, constraints, a lot of other names for this. The fundamental pieces are create, analyze, look at the context, make sure the requirements are being met, resolve problems where the business goals are not being met, and then deploy those into execution. Finally, the resource layer has the least number of elements, 8 to 10 so far. Inputs come from the process layer in terms of requirements. Feedback also, or input also comes from business environment. Output can go to process enablers in the execution of supply chain, or feedback to process layer. Focus of the resource layer is to analyze skills, fundamental automation, information automation, in terms of the resources necessary to execute the process goals. A lot of terminology, you might have a skills assessment, you might have business requirements documentation, you might have all sorts of things for machinery updates, repair, maintenance. All of these things happen in resource planning layer. The important part of this is that this is where the rubber meets the road. This is where execution has to happen, and these requirements feed into the parameters of the day-to-day process execution. Those are the four main layers of M4SC, and the focus on those is basically to understand what are all the components, make sure there are people responsible and accountable for executing strategy, process, network, resource, and to make sure that they're integrated and they're effective in what they're putting into place to meet business goals and objectives. So within a brief, fairly high-level overview of M4SC, I'd like to talk about a little more on the R&D program around this that we want to push forward over the next couple of months, participation in this, and what value you get as a volunteer from participating in the program. Okay. In the next month or so, through the balance of July and into August, today we've done the M4SC getting started, a little bit of overview, structure, program review, open conversation. Over the next couple of weeks, you're going to be focusing on next week the strategy layer, specifically what problems in supply chain management do the processes in the strategy layer address, what are the major components, how do they function, what do you do, what are the drivers, inputs to the strategy layer, how do you use the drivers, how do you use the output, and sort of the ongoing evolution of strategic view of supply chain management. So there's going to be roughly an hour of review of that process component, layer rather. 30th of July, we're looking at an hour overview in detail of the network layer. Same kind of components. What does it address in terms of problems in supply chain management? What are the major components, their drivers? How do you use this layer? What's the future evolution that we've seen of this? 6th of August, we'll be looking at the process layer, one of the more complex management areas, and a little bit more in detail of all the components of the process layer in terms of its processes and method. We'll do a repeat of this introduction around the 12th of August for anyone that's missed it, just to make sure they're still understanding the overall program and any updates we may have to the program. And then finally, we're going to conclude with the introduction on the 22nd of August with a 1-hour deep dive into the resource management layer. And again, similar view, what kind of problems is it addressing? What are the components, and how does this relate to the other layers? What is its future evolution? All right. That's the introduction to the details of M4SC, and concluding near the end of August. Then at the end of August, we start the formation of the volunteer organization. So we're bringing together the big volunteer team meeting, which is the overview of the research program, its organization with the focuses of the research. What are the education that we're going to be doing for the volunteers? What kind of time involvement are you going to be seeing in terms of what we're expecting in meetings and what we're expecting offline? What is research and development? How does this happen within the organization? And where are we looking for releases of this information in the future? So this is a fairly deep dive into what is a research project with Supply Chain Council. To continue along with the volunteers, 10th of September, we're doing a public and selected volunteer free public training in M4SC network management. So it's a 2-day deep dive, all of the components of the network system, training, examples, and exercises in a classroom setting. Following that, we'll be having a M4SC process training. Again, it's for the public and selected volunteer leaders for free. It's a 2-day training, and it goes through all the components of process management layer, how they're performed, example exercises, and how to take this into your organization. 16th of September, we then do the next piece of team organization, which is to talk about leadership and team design for each of the layers, strategy, network, process, resource, who wants to take which roles, what kind of documentation we're looking to come out of this, what's the communication and planning, and probably in a very strong sense, what are the research groups, how do we nominate them, how do we communicate around them. Finally, probably also a big discussion on what are your interests and capabilities in being in these different teams, and does that match up appropriately. 23rd of September, we're going to look at the strategic focus of M4SC, which are specifically what are the problems that we need, that we know about, that we'd like to see resolved in the next research cycle. These can be problems as complex as how do I get senior management to adopt a layered, managed approach to supply chain. It could be as simple as, do I need to add more financial research and communication into the system as a whole to look at better decision-making processes at each layer. So we want to have more or less a high level, what are the top 5, 3 or 4 or 5 business problems we'd like to see resolved with this? What are the component drivers to those problems, and what is our overall agreed methodology for the research related to those problems? 30th September is a planning meeting. So what are all the dates and times, 2013 through 2014, for virtual webinar-style meetings led by Melinda? What are necessary face-to-face meetings? What's the communication planning surrounding the teams? And to make sure that we're firm on the commitments that we're expecting from the volunteer team components. So we don't have meetings set up that the leader doesn't show up, or we have meetings where the volunteers have not sort of communicated or done anything to present at the meetings for agreement and debate. Basically just to make sure we get the planning and commitments in place. 17th of October is more of a tactical focus. Where do we store the data? Where do we store communications information, research information? How do you gather it? What's the assessment process? Where we have differences of opinion or prioritization, escalation, how do we resolve those conflicts? And how do we perform, and what are the components of the communication that we'd like to have within and outside of the research team? It's very tactically focused on how we're going to be doing the work. Then finally, in October, we're going to conclude this year's M4SC public volunteer training for 2 days for the resource management components. to bring everybody up to speed on that. Then 28th of October, we begin individual team research meetings. So within a week, you'll have one meeting for strategy team, one meeting for the network team, one meeting for the process team, one meeting for the resource team. The focus of these meetings through October and November is you'll have access to all of the M4SC presentation materials and other research materials, examples, spreadsheets, example companies. We'd like for you to review those in detail, basically what we used to call a business blueprint or conference room pilot. Walk through the processes of the methodology. If you have questions about how the step works, what you're supposed to do, where is this, at this point you get a clarification of the processes in that discussion. What we want to achieve is a verification that everybody in each individual team has a agreed baseline understanding of each of the layers, and that within that agreed understanding, everyone can understand where the gaps are. Now, what's interesting for me about this in particular, this is where the volunteer teams start to get a lot of value. You may be involved in research, rather in strategy in your company. You may be a very senior person working in supply chain strategy. You may be someone who doesn't know a lot about supply chain strategy or about to move into it. This is sort of the perfect opportunity for volunteers to start to do the discussion and information sharing from a very senior level to a very new level, so that you're actually learning from multiple sources, not just M4SC, how strategy works, how network management works, how process controls work in organizations. So this is where part of the volunteers to tell us what you don't understand, so that we make sure that the framework comprehends not just for sophisticated organizations, but we don't want to leave out for non-sophisticated organizations, particular elements of the training, elements of the definition that are really necessary for people to understand why do I even do this, why is this valuable to me. November 4th is continued review with these individual team meetings. It's up to the teams along in their planning whether the review is a 1 hour or 2 hour, 3 hour, longer debate. We're assuming that the team leads are the ones that drive the review process. Our research director, Casper, can be available for these meetings to clarify the information, in case there are questions that can't be resolved within the teams. 11 November, we'd like to see first pass at a SWOT analysis of M4SC in relation to the strategic focus. So the strategic focus is I've got to get my senior level people to buy in to using M4SC, then do a SWOT analysis of the system as it exists in relation to that goal. If the strategic goal is to put more financial information into it, great. Let's do a SWOT analysis in relation to the strategic focus for the period. What we really would like to look at from the research teams then are what are the major gaps in the current version and what are the opportunities surrounding those gaps, to go forward with. But this is really, for us, the first pass is saying, not how does this work? We know this material works. It's gleaned from companies that exist. We know companies have adopted this already. What we're interested in is where is it not going to meet someone's requirement or understanding. So those are the opportunities to put into this. 18th November, we'd like to see continued review on the SWOT analysis, gaps, opportunities. 25th of November, we believe that this should be, in terms of individual team research, a preparation for a face-to-face meeting in Palm Springs, prioritization of the issues, particularly around the opportunities and gaps, any low-hanging fruit that we can put into M4SC immediately to fix some of the gaps or issues, and consolidation of all the individual team member participations in terms of the research review, consolidation of their comments and information. So 5th of December in Palm Springs, technically, Melinda, I think it's Palm Desert. We will be hosting events there for the global teams, different research teams. In particular, there's a face-to-face with M4SC for the 4 different teams to, first of all, meet each other, see each other professionally, who they are, then go through, their understanding of the different layers, have a debate and sort of consensus, continued consensus on the strategic goals, review the gaps and opportunities that the teams have seen in analysis, and basically set down and say what they believe the path forward is for the next revision cycle around those goals and opportunities. I think the facility, Melinda can talk about that as we go a little bit on in time. There's about 150 or 180 slots at the Palm Springs facility. We're also going to be hosting a Lean Six Sigma team and 1 or 2 other research teams at the same event. So this is, if you're active in the research teams and you're aggressive about it, you need to get in fairly quickly to make sure you're going to be able to participate in this event with useful information. 9th of December, planning on webinar-based review of the individual team outcomes from the Palm Springs, development of an action plan for 2014. Finally, 16th of December, individual team research, Palm Spring outcomes review, finalization of the action plan for 2014. So our focus here is to, show people what is M4SC in detail of the 4 layers. Number 1. Number 2, form the volunteer teams, set out some strategic goals for how management could work better. Finally, then to do a month or so review of the existing materials so everyone's got a baseline understanding, look at the gaps and opportunities, come face-to-face to review those, take the outcomes from that, establish an action plan for 2014 for the next release and revision of M4SC training, the system itself, the documentation, and so forth and so on. So fairly aggressive, but I don't think there's another way to get, what we're looking for. We've got to get a lot of feedback, and we really want to work closely with these volunteers to do this. So what I'm going to leave you with today is a call to action. We'd like to see people participate in this complete review of the layers through August via webinar with our research director, Casper. We'd like for you to sign up as a research volunteer. Choose an area, whether it's strategy, whether it's the network, whether it's process, whether it's resources, best manages your expertise. Really like to see people at different levels of expertise participate, so we see a lot of education feedback with volunteer team members. And as a research volunteer, you'll have access outside of training to the full breadth of the M4SC system, much like SCOR. We want your review and feedback. We need to listen to you to say, how does this work? How can we make it work better? What do you think are the stumbling points in its use and its adoption by your company? We really want you to participate in the SEC-hosted Palm Springs event, meet the other research teams, join our global community as this extends. And call to action is you can drive meaningful change in the supply chain professional community. SCOR is the worldwide standard in operations management. It's a great standard. It's very useful. It's been well adopted from university level through software implementation to companies. 3,000 companies have been members of the council and gotten value out of using SCOR. We want a useful global standard in supply chain management, not just the operations. And we would like you to help create a well-used global standard, not an abstraction, not a sort of academic view of how management works, but very practical. How do I put this into place? How do I do this step? How do I make the right decisions for supply chain management? How do I keep it integrated? We'd like to see you drive that well-used and useful system as a global standard in supply chain management. There is no other system like this in the field today that integrates strategy, network, process, and resources through supply chain. So with that, I see a couple of questions coming up. For those of you that may or may not be members of Supply Chain Council, this is just a quick overview. Who we are, Supply Chain Industry Association. Basically, our focus is to advance tools and educate members on supply chain management, best ways to make that happen, global presence, volunteer-driven. So this is our focus here, is to create a framework, a straw man for supply chain management, and go back to volunteers and get information about it. Our research director is Casper Hunche, who is one of the principal authors of the M4SC current stage framework. M4SC volunteers, if you're interested in volunteering and want information, please contact Melinda Spring. She's coordinating, she's setting up all of the webinars and the events, and she'll be managing those herself. For more information about the Council itself, membership, training, certification, benchmarking, and research, focusing on SCOR-related frameworks, here you'll find the website, and for general information, here's our global contact point. So with that, I'm going to go back to Melinda, and if you can referee some of the questions.
Thank you, Joe. Yes, I actually have answered a couple of these questions already while you were presenting. I think one of the bigger questions is about, since this is a global team, it's a global research team. We have people from India, we have people from South Africa, from China, Australia, in a lot of different time zones. So when we work out the meetings for the teams, we will definitely accommodate people's different time zone locations the best that we can. We'll probably need to take turns with different people needing to be on early or late, but we do the best we can, or we schedule several meetings so that we can cover all the time zones. So I think that's one of the things I'm getting here. The one that I may want to turn over to you, Joe, is the question about what is available currently on the website around M4SC, like as the framework itself. And I know we don't have anything currently posted, but I don't know if you have a different answer for that, or we do have obviously reviews. There's other webinars that are posted. There's a lot of proceedings from the different M4SC overview presentations that Joe has been doing around the world in the different regional meetings. So the proceedings are posted, which covers some pieces of M4SC and an interactive workshop that we do around the framework, around one section of the framework. Do you have anything to add to that, Joe, as far as the person that's asking if we have more information currently available?
Yeah, so we don't have, I mean, this is why we're in the research teams, I suppose.
That's right.
As example, we don't have a quick reference guide for M4SC that just says, here's what the components of the modules are, here's how they interact with each other. Same way as we do with SCOR, something you could download. We're working on an M4SC overview, which gives a little bit more detail than these presentations. But I think, the first sort of call to action around this is to provide more information around the layers. We're currently, I'm very hesitant to release the full M4SC, sort of the PowerPoints that go through all of the processes, simply from the perspective of without information around them, it's just a big collection. It's 500 pages of methodology. So I think what we'd like to do is get people's feedback of what they would like to see in terms of more detail. And then over the next 4 to 6 weeks, we can probably write a few documents that provide more of that detail around the different elements. So for example, next week we're going to be going through the strategy layer and the 15 process elements of strategy. That's a lot of detail. The following week we're going to go through the network layer, the 10 or 15 process elements of the network layer in detail. That's a lot of information. What we don't want to do is just simply release the current training revision of all of this material without some guidance. That's why people who agree to be a volunteer, and that's a specific, not just I'm interested in this, can I get more information, but if you agree to be a volunteer in the organization, you then can go to review meetings through November, October, November, that deep dive into detail of all the process elements so that you can gain a deeper understanding of it. So we're not at the stage where we're releasing the M4SC manual yet.
Right. And also on the website where the M4SC information page is, which is actually listed under resources on the main website, there is a sign-up form. We already have about 70 people who have signed up to be volunteers. on that page. So if you're not signed up there and you are interested, that's where to look and where to sign up. I have another question about how much time. Everybody always asks this. How much time is this going to take from my schedule? And it's really your volunteers. You're not. So it's up to you how much time you can devote. If you can, we do ask that you attend every meeting, but if you can only give your feedback, and that's what you can do, your professional feedback, that's the main thing that we're looking for, and to attend the meetings. There's not going to be a whole lot of extra homework assignments, I think is what people get scared of when they see these kind of things.
Well, I normally would say it's 40 hours a week, but I think what we're requesting of people, that if they're interested, please spend an hour per week over the next 4 weeks to become acquainted with the details of the framework. As a volunteer, you'll then be invited to the detailed review meetings with the appropriate materials. That means that you'll attend a 1-hour weekly meeting, and you'll probably spend at least an hour offline reading the materials and identifying questions. Okay, so in the long run, what we're looking here is a couple of hours, maybe an hour or two per week. As you get further into the volunteer engagement, you may end up writing a module, you may end up doing some analysis, creating pieces of the company, for us to look at in terms of data and information. I mean, that's really up to you to decide how much time you want to put in. For specific people, so team leaders, document control people, communication people, they're going to be necessarily adding more time than others. But the value that they're going to get is we're going to invite those leadership people to free training, in other kinds of things through the council that will sort of hopefully make up for the time that they're pushing into the system on a volunteer basis.
Yeah, and also the people that do end up putting more time into this are usually people who are actually doing this for their companies. In other words, the work is benefiting your company. It's a benefit to your position in your company, to your experience, to your professional experience as an employee of that company. And so, if people that start to that I see start to really do a lot of work and get very, very personally engaged in a project, it's because it's not just for them. It's because the company is supporting them. The company supports their time being devoted to the project, and it's benefiting, what they're learning is benefiting the company as well. So it's not just a personal volunteer issue. It becomes more of a company organizational volunteer effort. So that's part of what happens.
Melinda, how much time was involved when you did the risk meeting?
We do, well, the risk meetings, we would do a meeting an hour meeting every week or two, depending on the stage of the project. Because if we're building into a deadline, so for example, if that project had to be built into the deadline of when SCOR 10, maybe we first did it for SCOR 9, so there are deadlines built in, and we would always make sure we had the SCOR model done by the conference. So we worked these into the deadlines, and so we would have a 1-hour meeting every week leading up to those deadlines. But before that, we would start with a meeting every month, or meeting every couple of weeks, and we would only go through the top issues. Everybody took a piece of it. Probably did spend an hour during the week on it. And then we would report back to each other and have the discussion during that meeting, during the weekly meeting. And there was debate. There's that's the reason for it, because everybody has different experience and different needs. And so we work on it until everybody's satisfied. if extra meetings are needed to meet a deadline, then we do that. But I've found that actually volunteers are very good at working with deadlines because we all understand that. You know, we all have deadlines. So.
Okay. I see that there's a message from Bob Ferrari. Which companies or organizations have initially piloted M4SC? We went through a training with Air Products, DuPont, Penske Logistics, Avnet, Ericsson, and a couple of others. And we also had some sort of offline reviews with a couple of organizations. At least 2 of these companies immediately picked up M4SC, and not company-wide, but at least within a division, started using M4SC to do their strategy and network processes. That's our perception. We were actually invited to come in for review and observation of how they use the processes. So that was from the beta test training way back in mid-2012. Melinda?
Yes. Sorry, I was reading.
Okay.
I'm getting a lot of questions at the last minute. Someone's asking about who is going to facilitate the discussions, and I am going to be facilitating, and we'll have leaders for each team as well as we go through. We'll work on it so that there's always a leader. I'll be facilitating. We'll have leaders facilitating each group, so that's already. We'll make sure we get that taken care of. I have some questions here about membership. In order to do volunteer work for the council, you really do need to be a member, because in order to give you access, I need to give it's membership access. So to get in to see the models and the frameworks and the research work. So if you're not a member and you want to participate in this and you're having trouble getting your company to let you be a member or to become a member, let me know so we can help you convince your company to join, or your organization. I've got a couple of those questions here. And I think that's the main. Okay, here's something about the white paper.
There's a white paper on the website.
Right.
Melinda, if you could just send that out with a follow-up to everybody on the conference call.
Sure.
I also want to amplify what Melinda said. In M4SC, we're not going to be training people in SCOR. There's no training in the supply chain operations reference, process modeling. There's no training or updates on the metrics, benchmarking, the processes of doing this. Our assumption is not just that you're a member, but that you have a fair amount of basic knowledge of SCOR and the SCOR framework and application, because this is really supply chain management layered on top of the standard reference. So we invite those people who are not SCOR, I want to say SCOR P certified. I'm not worried about that. But if you've not had SCOR framework training, so you're aware of of all the components, we would really strongly invite you to get that, because otherwise, the moment these teams start delving into metrics analysis for strategy, or metrics decomposition for network or process models or skills, you're going to be wondering, what are they talking about? So it's not just membership; it's also pretty good knowledge, familiarity with SCOR itself.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. This isn't like a beginner course. I also have some questions about locations of meetings. I know that we talked about the research meeting is going to be in California in the States. The training meetings are in Houston. Joe, you and I can talk maybe about how to get some sort of virtual way for people on the other side of the world to possibly attend that virtually, or some other solution for people who are in China, etc.
Yeah.
And as far as the face-to-face meetings, we may be able to also fit something in around the Europe conference in October for the Europe community. So we'll do what we can to accommodate the global team.
Yeah, I mean, just as an update, we've got meetings going to be occurring around sort of executive briefings with brief workshops that are taken from one or two processes in M4SC. And these have been occurring around the world already. So if there's interest for the volunteer groups, more than happy to facilitate face-to-face review meetings as appropriate. Upcoming, we're going to be in Philadelphia, New York, Boston, Frankfurt, Madrid, probably Milan, Rome. We're going to be in London in September. We're going to be in Melbourne in August. We're going to be in Durban, Johannesburg, and Cape Town in September. So Asia, we're going to be, November forward, we're going to be heavily in Asia. We'll be probably Bangkok, Kuala Lumpur, and Singapore, as well as in Shanghai. And then we're also going to be doing these events even more sort of detail in Melbourne, Sydney, Auckland in December. And then we're also planning for these going forward in January. Melinda was actively involved in the planning. So April is also the Supply Chain World event. So there's no lack of opportunity for us to plan additional M4SC face-to-faces at the regional level. I think the question here is get up to date. Let's focus through November with getting everyone up to speed on the baseline version of M4SC. Then, as necessary, we can do a fairly intense face-to-face scheduling as appropriate.
Right. Yeah, I have someone asking, "Oh, you didn't include the Middle East." So I'm like, yes.
Well, I'm not going to go to Cairo anytime soon,
Yeah.
or Syria. We're happy to go we're happy to do these meetings in Jeddah and Dubai. It really is going to be on basis on the demand of the volunteers in the region. We're also doing a fair amount of development and starting up in Istanbul and Eastern Europe. There may be some opportunities there for the Middle East to come up, or for us to go down to Jeddah is hard to travel to, but Dubai or Doha seem to be pretty easy for most people.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, well, I think that we're running a little bit over. So, and I know people need to leave to go to their next things.
Just a couple of questions. Vicky Ko, the PowerPoint will be linked to the PowerPoint will be sent out to everyone who registered for the event. Mm-hmm. Yes, Milan, please. What about Middle East? I think we touched on that. 800 employees, thank you, reply.
Oh, I already answered him. I already answered those. Yeah.
Okay, I think we've got most of
that's membership question.
And please, if you have further questions, please send them on to Melinda, and we'll consolidate. There's another meeting next week, which is detail and strategy, and we can also, any open questions, we can start to address those for the people interested in volunteering.
Right. Oh, I've got something. Hold on, just one more thing here. Okay, never mind. And also South America. No, we didn't forget South America. We've got a great.
No. You'll get everyone who's registered will get a copy of this presentation.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, everybody. Anything else, Joe?
No, thank you, Melinda. I'm sorry about the delay at the beginning. We had some challenges with the meeting control system, but I think we'll be good for next week.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and I'll be in touch with everybody with follow-up materials, etc. So thank you all, and hope to see you or hear you or be with you again next Tuesday for the next webinar. So have a good evening, morning, sleep for wherever you are in the world. Thank you, and good day.
Bye-bye.